In the early days of the Pacific War, Japanese fighter pilots soared through the skies with an arrogance born from countless victories, their Zero fighters dancing through the air like deadly birds of prey, untouchable and supreme. They laughed at the American dive bombers, those slow and clumsy Douglas SBD dauntless aircraft that seemed to lumber through the sky like flying coffins, easy targets for their superior speed and maneuverability. The Japanese pilots called them names, mocked their awkward appearance, and treated them as little more than practice targets during aerial combat. But what these confident warriors did not know was that they were witnessing the birth of a legend, the forging of a weapon so precise and so deadly that it would turn the tide of the entire war in the Pacific. This is the story of how American dive bomber pilots transformed from objects of ridicule into instruments of perfect destruction, how they learned to never miss their targets, and how their incredible accuracy would shatter the Japanese naval dominance and change the course of history forever. It is a tale of courage, skill, innovation, and determination that would prove that sometimes the underestimated become the unstoppable. The Empire of Japan entered the Second World War with a naval aviation force that was considered the finest in the world, a collection of experienced pilots who had been fighting in China for years and had developed skills that seemed almost superhuman to their enemies. These men flew the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, an aircraft so advanced for its time that it could outclimb, outmaneuver, and outrun almost anything the Allies could put into the sky during those early dark months of the war. The Japanese naval aviators had trained for years in demanding programs that pushed them to their absolute limits, creating an elite force of warriors who believed themselves invincible. Their confidence was not merely arrogance, but seemed justified by their stunning victories across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. Everywhere the rising sun flag appeared, Allied forces crumbled before the might of Japanese air power. The pilots who flew these missions returned to their carriers with stories of easy victories, of enemy aircraft falling from the sky like broken toys, and of targets destroyed with minimal resistance. In this atmosphere of triumph and superiority, the Japanese aviators began to develop a dangerous sense of invulnerability that would later prove to be their undoing. The American forces that faced this onslaught in late 1941 and early 1942 were equipped with aircraft that seemed hopelessly outmatched by comparison. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which would become the hero of our story, was a sturdy but unspectacular aircraft that had been designed in the late 1930s and appeared thoroughly unremarkable to anyone who saw it. It was not particularly fast, reaching a maximum speed of only about 250 miles per hour, which made it vulnerable to fighter attack. It was not heavily armed, carrying only 2 forward-firing machine guns and twin guns in the rear cockpit for the radioman gunner to operate. It could carry only a single 1,000-pound bomb or smaller ordnance, which seemed inadequate compared to the massive payloads of land-based bombers. To the confident Japanese pilots who encountered these aircraft in the early battles of the Pacific War, the Dauntless appeared to be nothing more than target practice, a slow and ungainly bird that would fall easily to their superior fighters. They nicknamed it the Flying Coffin and joked among themselves about how easy it was to shoot down these American bombers. Little did they know that this humble aircraft contained within it the seeds of their ultimate defeat. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not designed to be a glamorous fighter or a massive bomber, but rather a specialized tool for a very specific and dangerous job. And understanding what made it special requires looking beyond its modest appearance to the innovative features that lay beneath its ordinary exterior. The letters SBD stood for Scout Bomber Douglas, indicating that this aircraft was meant to find enemy ships and then attack them from above, a role that demanded different qualities than those valued in fighter combat. The most important feature of the Dauntless was its dive brakes, large perforated flaps that extended from the wings and allowed the aircraft to dive almost straight down at a target without accelerating to dangerous speeds that would tear the aircraft apart or make it impossible to control. These dive breaks were the key to the entire concept of dive bombing, allowing pilots to point their aircraft directly at a target and release their bombs at low altitude, where accuracy was dramatically improved compared to level bombing from high altitude. The Dauntless also featured a robust airframe that could withstand the tremendous stresses of pulling out of steep dives, with reinforced wings and fuselage that could handle forces that would destroy lighter aircraft. The cockpit of the Dauntless was designed with the dive bombing mission in mind, featuring a reflector sight that projected aiming information onto a transparent screen in front of the pilot, allowing him to keep his eyes focused outside the aircraft while maintaining awareness of his diving angle and bomb release point. Behind the pilot sat the radioman gunner, a second crew member whose job was to operate the radio equipment, navigate, and defend the aircraft from rear attacks using twin 30-caliber machine guns mounted on a flexible ring. This partnership between pilot and gunner would prove crucial in countless battles, with many Dauntless crews developing bonds of trust and friendship that lasted their entire lives. The aircraft was also remarkably reliable, with its Wright Cyclone radial engine proving capable of taking battle damage and continuing to run, bringing many crews home safely despite wounds that would have downed less sturdy aircraft. In the hands of a skilled pilot who understood its strengths and limitations, the Dauntless could perform feats that seemed impossible to observers, but realizing that potential required training, courage, and experience that American aviators were only beginning to develop as the war began. The first months of the Pacific War brought nothing but disaster and humiliation for American forces, with Japanese victories seeming to cascade one after another in an unstoppable tide of conquest that threatened to sweep across the entire ocean. The dive bomber squadrons that would later become legendary were forced to operate under conditions of desperate disadvantage, lacking proper support, adequate intelligence, and sufficient numbers to make any real difference against the overwhelming Japanese onslaught. At Pearl Harbor, many American dive bombers were destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to fight, and those that survived found themselves operating from bases that were under constant threat of attack. In the Philippines, American air power was largely wiped out in the opening days of the war, leaving ground forces without air support and dooming them to eventual defeat and surrender. The dive bomber pilots who did manage to get into the air during these early battles faced daunting odds, often attacking heavily defended targets without fighter escort and suffering terrible casualties for minimal results. The Japanese pilots who encountered these early American attacks had every reason to feel confident and superior, as the dive bombers they faced often appeared poorly coordinated, inadequately trained, and desperately outmatched by the defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Many Dauntless bombers were shot down before reaching their targets, and those that did make it through often missed their aims, with bombs falling harmlessly into the ocean or causing only minor damage to enemy ships. The Japanese aviators began to develop a contemptuous attitude toward these American attackers, viewing them as brave perhaps but hopelessly incompetent, lacking the skill and discipline that characterized Japanese naval aviation. This mockery was not entirely unjustified in those early days, as American pilots were indeed struggling with inadequate training, poor tactics, and equipment problems that hampered their effectiveness. What the Japanese failed to recognize was that these defeats were teaching the Americans valuable lessons, that each failure was being analyzed and studied, and that a new generation of dive bomber pilots was beginning to emerge who would learn from these mistakes and develop methods that would transform the Dauntless from a target into a weapon of devastating precision. Survival became the first teacher for American dive bomber crews, and those who lived through the early battles began to develop tactics and techniques that would gradually improve their effectiveness and their chances of returning home alive. The pilots learned that attacking in a coordinated group was far more effective than individual strikes, as multiple bombers diving on a target simultaneously could overwhelm the defenses and ensure that at least some bombs would hit even if others missed. They discovered that the altitude from which they began their dives made an enormous difference, with higher altitudes providing more time for the defenders to react, but also allowing for longer, more stable dives that improved accuracy. Through painful trial and error, the dive bomber pilots worked out the optimal dive angle of approximately 70 degrees, steep enough to provide excellent accuracy, but not so vertical that it became impossible to pull out safely. They learned to watch their altimeters carefully, knowing that releasing their bombs too high reduced accuracy, while releasing too low might not give them enough time to pull out of the dive before crashing into the ocean or the target itself. The training programs back in the United States began to incorporate the lessons learned from these early battles, with new pilots spending countless hours practicing dive bombing techniques on targets in calm waters off the California coast or in the Gulf of Mexico. These training exercises were demanding and dangerous, with accidents claiming lives even in peacetime conditions, but they produced pilots who arrived in the Pacific with skills far superior to those of the first wave of aviators. The instructors emphasized the importance of the dive bombing procedure, teaching pilots to roll inverted at the top of their attack run so they could pull the nose down into the dive while keeping the target in sight, then rolling upright as they plunged toward the ocean below. They practiced releasing their bombs at the correct moment, learning to compensate for wind, aircraft speed, and the momentum of the bomb itself. They trained their eyes to judge distances accurately without relying solely on instruments, developing an instinctive feel for when they had reached the optimal release point. Most importantly, they learned to remain calm under the stress of combat, to ignore the anti-aircraft fire exploding around them and the enemy fighters diving on their tails, focusing entirely on putting their bomb precisely where it needed to go. In early May of 1942, American and Japanese naval forces clashed in the Coral Sea in what would become the first aircraft carrier battle in history, where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, and all the fighting was done by aircraft attacking across hundreds of miles of open ocean. For the American dive bomber pilots, this battle represented an opportunity to prove that they had learned from their earlier defeats and could strike back effectively against the Japanese fleet. The dauntless squadrons launched from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, forming up in the tropical sky before heading off toward the reported position of enemy carriers, knowing that they were flying into a battle that could determine the fate of Australia and the entire South Pacific. The pilots focused their minds on the task ahead, running through their dive bombing procedures mentally, checking their equipment, and trying to ignore the fear that gnawed at every combat aviator who knew that many of those who flew out would never return. When the American dive bombers found the Japanese carrier Shoho, they demonstrated for the first time the devastating effectiveness that properly coordinated dive bombing could achieve, with squadron after squadron rolling into their dives and plunging toward the enemy ship like hunting eagles descending on prey. The Japanese carrier twisted and turned desperately, trying to evade the bombs that fell toward it with ever-increasing accuracy, but there were simply too many attackers coming from too many directions for the ship to avoid them all. Bomb after bomb struck home, with massive explosions tearing through the carrier's flight deck and igniting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within minutes, the Shoho was transformed from a powerful warship into a burning wreck that would soon slip beneath the waves, taking hundreds of Japanese sailors with it. The American pilots who witnessed this destruction felt a surge of satisfaction and vindication, knowing that they had finally proven that dive bombers could sink major enemy warships when properly employed. The battle also saw attacks on the larger Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku, and while these ships survived, they suffered damage that forced them to withdraw from the battle and kept them out of action for months afterward. The success at Coral Sea gave American dive bomber crews new confidence, but they understood that the real test was still to come, as intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were planning a massive operation that would force a decisive battle somewhere in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his intelligence officers worked frantically to determine where the Japanese would strike next, analyzing radio intercepts and piecing together clues that pointed toward a tiny atoll called Midway, a strategic outpost that served as the westernmost point of American defense in the Pacific. The dive bomber squadrons based on the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown prepared for what they knew would be the most important battle of their lives, a confrontation that might determine whether America would eventually win the war or face years of costly fighting just to achieve a stalemate. The pilots attended briefings where they studied photographs and maps of Japanese carriers, memorizing the silhouettes so they could identify targets instantly during the chaos of combat. They checked and rechecked their aircraft, ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly and that their bombs were properly armed and loaded. In the ready rooms of the American carriers, pilots sat in leather chairs and tried to rest before the battle, but most found sleep impossible as they contemplated what lay ahead. They wrote letters to loved ones back home, knowing that these might be the last words their families would ever receive from them. They talked quietly among themselves, sharing jokes and memories, building the bonds of brotherhood that would help them face the terror of combat. The more experienced pilots tried to mentor the younger ones, sharing advice about dive bombing techniques and offering encouragement to men who had never been in battle before. Everyone understood that the coming fight would be different from anything they had experienced before, that the Japanese would be bringing the full might of their carrier fleet, and that the margin for error would be razor thin. The American dive bomber crews knew that they would need to achieve near-perfect accuracy if they were to have any chance of defeating an enemy force that outnumbered them and possessed fighters and pilots that were still considered superior in individual combat. What they did not know was that they were about to participate in a battle that would be remembered as one of the most decisive naval engagements in all of human history. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean on June 4, 1942, illuminating a scene of deceptive tranquility, with gentle swells rolling across thousands of square miles of empty water that gave no hint of the massive fleets that were maneuvering for position somewhere over the horizon. Aboard the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, pilots prepared their aircraft for strikes against Midway Island, confident that they would soon crush the American defenders and open the way for an invasion that would extend Japanese control even further across the Pacific. The Japanese aircrews had already achieved remarkable success that morning, with their bombers hitting Midway's facilities and defenses, and they were preparing for a second strike when suddenly word arrived that American carriers had been spotted in the area, transforming what should have been a simple operation into a major fleet battle. In the chaos that followed this discovery, the Japanese crews frantically worked to switch their bombs from land attack weapons to anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, creating confusion on the carrier decks and leaving aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance exposed in ways that violated normal safety procedures. Meanwhile, the American carriers had launched their own strikes, sending torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters racing toward the reported position of the Japanese fleet. But the coordination between these different groups quickly broke down due to communication problems and navigation errors. The torpedo bomber squadrons arrived at the target area first and bravely pressed home their attacks despite having no fighter cover, flying slow and low as they approached the Japanese carriers in an attempt to get close enough to launch their torpedoes effectively. The Japanese fighter pilots swarmed over these vulnerable attackers like wolves descending on sheep, shooting down plane after plane with brutal efficiency, while the torpedo bombers struggled to line up their attack runs. The American torpedoes, plagued by defective depth controls and weak warheads, proved almost completely ineffective even when they did manage to hit Japanese ships, running too deep or failing to explode on impact. Within a matter of minutes, entire squadrons of torpedo bombers had been wiped out, with casualties approaching 100% in some units, and the Japanese pilots felt their confidence surge as they easily defeated this American attack, proving once again their superiority in aerial combat. The disaster that befell the American torpedo bombers seemed to confirm everything that Japanese pilots believed about their superiority over American aviators. And as the last of the torpedo planes were shot down or driven away, the defending fighters began to land back on their carriers to refuel and rearm, satisfied that they had defeated another incompetent American attack. What the Japanese did not know was that high above them, invisible against the bright morning sky, American dive bomber squadrons were finally arriving at the battle area after long searches that had taken them far across the ocean. And these pilots were about to demonstrate a level of skill and accuracy that would shock everyone who witnessed it. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had taken his squadrons beyond the point where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be, and was considering turning back when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed, correctly deducing that this ship must be hurrying to rejoin the main fleet and deciding to follow it to its destination. This decision, made in a moment of intuitive judgment under conditions of tremendous stress and uncertainty, would prove to be one of the most consequential choices made by any pilot during the entire war. When McCluskey's squadrons arrived over the Japanese fleet, they found a scene that seemed almost too perfect to be real, with all 4 enemy carriers visible below them, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, and almost no defending fighters at altitude because those Zeros had just expended their ammunition shooting down the torpedo bombers and were landing to rearm. The dive bomber pilots could hardly believe their good fortune, understanding that they had been given an opportunity that might never come again, a chance to strike at the heart of Japanese naval power when it was most vulnerable. McCluskey quickly assigned targets, directing his squadrons to attack the carriers Akagi and Kaga, while other dive bomber groups that were arriving from Yorktown would hit a third carrier. The pilots rolled their dauntless bombers inverted, pulled their noses down into steep dives, and plunged toward the enemy ships below with a precision and coordination that came from months of training and the hard lessons learned in earlier battles. As they dove, the pilots focused entirely on their targets, ignoring the anti-aircraft fire that now erupted from every Japanese ship, keeping their reflector sights steady on the carrier flight decks that grew larger with every passing second. The dive bomber pilots released their 1,000-pound bombs at altitudes between 2,000 and 1,500 feet, pulling out of their dives so close to the ocean that spray from their propellers kicked up mist behind them as they leveled off and began their escape runs at wave-top height. Behind them, the bombs they had released continued downward at tremendous velocity, falling with an accuracy that seemed almost impossible given the difficulty of hitting a moving ship from an aircraft diving at nearly 300 miles per hour through hostile fire. The first bomb struck the Akagi within seconds of each other, with one penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the aircraft that were being serviced below, igniting fuel and ordnance in a series of secondary explosions that transformed the carrier into an inferno. Another bomb hit near the elevators, jamming them and making it impossible to move aircraft between the hangar deck and the flight deck, trapping the carrier's air group below where fires were spreading with terrifying speed. On the Kaga, similar devastation unfolded as American bombs crashed through the wooden flight deck and exploded in the midst of fueled and armed aircraft, creating fireballs that swept through the ship's interior and started fires that the damage control teams found impossible to contain. The dive bomber pilots who attacked these carriers later reported with amazement that their accuracy had been far better than anything they had achieved in training, with bomb after bomb striking the targets instead of falling harmlessly into the ocean, as had happened so often in earlier battles. The combination of perfect conditions, excellent training, improved tactics, and perhaps most importantly the absence of fighter interference during the crucial moments of the dive, had allowed the American aviators to demonstrate the true potential of dive bombing as a precision weapon. The Japanese sailors on the stricken carriers fought desperately to save their ships, but the fires were already beyond control, fed by aviation gasoline, bombs and torpedoes that cooked off in spectacular explosions as the heat reached them. Within minutes of being hit, the Akagi and Kaga had been transformed from powerful weapons of war into death traps for their crews, with hundreds of men trapped below decks in compartments that were rapidly filling with smoke and flame. A third carrier, the Soryu, was attacked by dive bombers from Yorktown and suffered a similar fate, taking multiple bomb hits that started uncontrollable fires and doomed the ship to destruction. The Japanese fleet, which had steamed into battle that morning with complete confidence in its superiority and invincibility, suddenly found itself reeling from a catastrophe that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, transforming triumph into disaster in the span of 5 minutes. The surviving Japanese carrier, Huryu, immediately launched a counterattack, sending its bombers and fighters to hunt down the American carriers, and these skilled aviators managed to find and severely damage the Yorktown, scoring bomb and torpedo hits that would eventually send that American carrier to the bottom. But this success came at a terrible price, as American scouts quickly located the Huryu and dive bombers from Enterprise raced to attack this last remaining Japanese carrier before it could launch another strike. The dive bomber pilots who attacked Huryu demonstrated once again the incredible accuracy they had achieved, placing multiple bombs directly on the carrier's flight deck and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship, sealing its fate just as surely as the other carriers had been doomed earlier that morning. By the end of that extraordinary day, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were burning wrecks that would sink beneath the Pacific waves, taking with them not only irreplaceable ships, but also hundreds of highly trained aircrew and mechanics whose skills had taken years to develop and could not be quickly replaced. The Japanese pilots who had mocked American dive bombers as clumsy and ineffective, who had shot down the torpedo bombers with contemptuous ease just hours before, now understood with terrible clarity that they had underestimated their enemy in the most catastrophic way possible. The American dive bomber pilots had achieved a level of accuracy that approached perfection when it mattered most, with a hit rate during the crucial attacks that far exceeded anything that could have been expected based on peacetime training exercises or earlier combat operations. The mockery and contempt that Japanese aviators had directed at the Dauntless and its crews now seemed like tragic hubris, a failure to recognize that the Americans were learning, improving, and developing into a force that would ultimately prove unstoppable. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Midway, both sides struggled to understand exactly what had happened and why the outcome had been so dramatically one-sided despite the Japanese advantages in experience and equipment that had seemed so decisive in earlier battles. American analysts studying the battle reports were amazed by the accuracy that dive bomber pilots had achieved during the crucial attacks, with hit rates far exceeding statistical expectations, and demonstrating that dive bombing had evolved from an experimental tactic into a devastating precision weapon. The pilots themselves often had difficulty explaining exactly how they had managed to achieve such incredible accuracy under combat conditions, but certain factors became clear as the battle was reconstructed and analyzed. The absence of fighter interference during the critical moments had been absolutely crucial, allowing pilots to focus entirely on their bombing runs without having to evade attacking Zeros or worry about being shot down before reaching their release points. The fact that all the dive bombers had arrived over the target at nearly the same time, despite navigation problems that had scattered the American strike groups across hundreds of miles of ocean, had created a saturation attack that overwhelmed Japanese defenses and prevented them from concentrating their fire effectively against individual bombers. The training that dive bomber pilots had received, incorporating lessons from earlier battles and emphasizing the mechanics of accurate bomb delivery, had paid enormous dividends when pilots found themselves in actual combat with ideal conditions to demonstrate their skills. The reliability and ruggedness of the Dauntless itself had been proven beyond doubt, with the aircraft absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed less sturdy planes and still bringing their crews home safely. Perhaps most importantly, the American pilots had shown remarkable courage and determination, pressing home their attacks despite anti-aircraft fire, and the knowledge that many of them would not survive the mission, maintaining focus on their bombing runs when lesser men might have panicked or lost their nerve. The Japanese, for their part, were forced to confront the reality that their early victories had bred a dangerous overconfidence that had blinded them to the improvements American forces were making, and that their contempt for enemy capabilities had contributed to tactical decisions that left their carriers vulnerable at exactly the wrong moment. After Midway, the reputation of American dive bomber pilots and their dauntless aircraft was transformed completely, with these crews now regarded as elite warriors who had achieved one of the most decisive victories in naval history, and proven that air power could indeed sink major warships when employed with skill and determination. The Japanese aviators who had survived Midway never again spoke mockingly of American dive bombers, having learned through bitter experience that these aircraft and their pilots were far more dangerous than their unglamorous appearance suggested. In the battles that followed Midway, from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, dive bombers continued to sink Japanese ships and support American advances across the Pacific, building on the foundation of skill and tactics that had been established during that crucial engagement in June of 1942. The pilots who flew these missions understood that they were part of a tradition of excellence that had been forged in combat and paid for with the blood of those who had died learning the lessons that made victory possible. The dauntless dive bomber itself became an icon of American naval aviation, its distinctive shape recognized instantly by friend and foe alike as a symbol of precision and deadly effectiveness. Younger pilots joining the dive bomber squadrons learned about the Battle of Midway and studied the techniques that had made that victory possible, aspiring to achieve the same level of accuracy and effectiveness that their predecessors had demonstrated. The aircraft continued in frontline service until late in the war, when newer and more capable dive bombers began to replace it. But even then, the Dauntless remained respected and even beloved by those who had flown it in combat. Many pilots would later say that the Dauntless had saved their lives through its toughness and reliability, bringing them home despite damage that should have sent them into the ocean, and they credited the aircraft's solid construction and forgiving flight characteristics with giving them the stable platform they needed to achieve accurate bomb delivery under combat conditions. Behind the legend and the statistics lay human stories of courage, sacrifice, and loss that gave meaning to the strategic victories and tactical successes achieved by dive bomber squadrons throughout the Pacific War. Every pilot and gunner who climbed into a Dauntless for a combat mission knew that he might not return, that the next dive could be his last, and that dying in a burning aircraft or drowning in the ocean after being shot down were very real possibilities that haunted the thoughts of even the bravest men. The crews who survived combat missions often did so only because of luck, split-second decisions, or the actions of their squadron mates who drew enemy fire away from them or fought off attacking fighters that would otherwise have shot them down. The psychological stress of repeated combat missions was enormous, with pilots and gunners suffering from nightmares, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then simply called combat fatigue or battle exhaustion. The bonds formed between dive bomber crew members were intensely strong, forged in the shared experience of facing death together, and depending on each other for survival in situations where any mistake could be fatal. Pilots and their radioman gunners often flew together for extended periods, developing wordless communication and absolute trust that allowed them to function as a single unit during the chaos of combat. When crews were shot down and killed, their squadron mates mourned them deeply, sometimes struggling with survivors' guilt and wondering why they had lived while their friends had died. The ground crews who maintained the aircraft also felt these losses keenly, as they sent pilots off to battle in planes they had worked on, and then waited anxiously for those crews to return, feeling personal responsibility when aircraft were shot down or damaged. The victory at Midway and the other successes achieved by dive bomber squadrons came at a price measured in young lives cut short, families left to grieve, and men who returned home carrying psychological scars that would never fully heal. As the Pacific War progressed, dive bomber tactics continued to evolve and improve, building on the lessons learned at Midway and incorporating new techniques developed through experience and experimentation. Pilots refined their understanding of the optimal approach angles for different types of targets, learning that attacking from different directions simultaneously made it much harder for enemy ships to evade and forced defensive gunners to split their fire. They developed better methods for coordinating attacks with torpedo bombers and fighters, creating combined strikes that overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer complexity, and made it nearly impossible for defenders to concentrate effectively against any single threat. The introduction of better bomb sights and improved aiming techniques further increased accuracy, with some pilots achieving hit rates that seemed almost impossible to observers who did not understand the skill and training required to reach such levels of precision. Communication procedures improved dramatically as the war went on, with better radios and standardized protocols making it much easier for strike groups to coordinate their actions and adjust to changing circumstances during missions. Intelligence gathering became more sophisticated, giving pilots better information about enemy ship movements and defensive capabilities before they launched on missions, allowing them to plan attacks that exploited weaknesses in enemy formations and caught defenders by surprise. The training programs for new pilots incorporated all these improvements, producing aviators who arrived in combat squadron with skills that would have seemed extraordinary compared to the barely trained pilots of early 1942. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to replace the experienced pilots they had lost at Midway and in subsequent battles, with newer aviators lacking the training time and combat experience that had made their predecessors so formidable, creating a growing skill gap that favored American forces more decisively with each passing month. While the SBD Dauntless remained in service through much of the war and compiled an impressive record of achievements that included sinking more enemy ships than any other Allied bomber type, eventually it was supplemented and then replaced by newer aircraft that incorporated improved performance and capabilities. The Curtiss SB-C Heldover entered service in 1943 as the intended replacement for the Dauntless, offering better speed, range, and bomb-carrying capacity. But pilots initially disliked the new aircraft because it was more difficult to fly and less forgiving of mistakes than the beloved Dauntless. The Heldover suffered from numerous technical problems early in its service life, leading some squadrons to resist transitioning to the new type and continue flying their older Dauntless bombers as long as possible. Eventually, the bugs were worked out and the Heldover became an effective weapon in its own right, but it never quite achieved the legendary status of its predecessor in the hearts of the pilots who flew it. The evolution of naval aviation continued beyond dive bombers as well, with fighter bombers and rocket-armed aircraft taking on many of the anti-shipping missions that had previously been the exclusive domain of specialized dive bombers. Jet aircraft began to appear late in the war, promising speeds and performance that would make propeller-driven bombers obsolete, though they arrived too late to play any significant role in the Pacific conflict. The principles of accurate dive bombing that had been developed and perfected during the war years would continue to influence naval aviation doctrine for decades afterward, with modern attack aircraft still using dive delivery techniques when precision is required, despite the availability of guided weapons and sophisticated targeting systems. The legacy of the dive bomber pilots who had achieved near-perfect accuracy at Midway and in subsequent battles lived on in the training and tactics of naval aviators who came after them, a testament to the enduring importance of skill, courage, and determination in aerial combat. Understanding the complete story of how dive bombers evolved from objects of mockery to instruments of precision destruction requires examining the Japanese perspective and understanding how their view of American capabilities changed so dramatically over the course of the war. The early Japanese contempt for American dive bombers was not merely prejudice, but was based on actual observations of poorly executed attacks and ineffective bombing during the opening months of the conflict, when American pilots were indeed struggling with inadequate training and poor coordination. The Japanese aviators who mocked the Dauntless and its crews were comparing them to their own highly trained and experienced pilots who had been fighting in China for years and represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. From their perspective, the Americans seemed amateurish and incompetent, flying outdated equipment with tactics that appeared suicidal given their lack of fighter cover, and their tendency to attack well-defended targets without adequate reconnaissance or planning. The shock of Midway forced Japanese pilots and commanders to completely reassess their evaluation of American capabilities, recognizing that they had underestimated the speed with which their enemies could learn and adapt. The devastating accuracy of the dive bomber attacks that destroyed 4 carriers in a single day could not be dismissed as luck or accident, but clearly demonstrated that American pilots had achieved a level of skill that rivaled or exceeded that of Japanese aviators in this particular type of combat. The psychological impact of this defeat on Japanese naval aviation was profound, destroying the sense of invincibility that had characterized their earlier operations and forcing them to acknowledge that they were facing enemies who were not only brave but increasingly competent and effective. In the years that followed Midway, Japanese pilots learned to treat American dive bombers with great respect, understanding that these ungainly-looking aircraft could deliver devastating attacks when given the opportunity, and that underestimating them was a potentially fatal mistake. The remarkable improvement in American dive bomber accuracy between the early defeats of late 1941 and the triumph at Midway in June 1942 was the result of both technological refinements and dramatic improvements in training methods that transformed raw recruits into skilled combat aviators. The training program for dive bomber pilots became increasingly rigorous and realistic as the war progressed, with instructors who had combat experience returning to the United States to share the lessons they had learned and incorporate them into the curriculum. Student pilots spent hundreds of hours practicing dive bombing runs on target rafts positioned in bays and coastal waters, learning to judge their altitude and angle by eye, and developing the muscle memory required to execute perfect dives even under the stress of combat. They practiced in all weather conditions and at different times of day, learning to compensate for sun glare, wind, and visibility problems that could affect bombing accuracy. Technological improvements to the Dauntless itself, though relatively minor compared to the introduction of entirely new aircraft types, contributed to improved effectiveness by making the aircraft more reliable and easier to fly precisely during dive bombing runs. Better gun sights helped pilots aim more accurately, while improved bomb racks ensured more reliable release and reduced the chance of bombs hanging up and refusing to drop when the pilot pressed the release button. Radio equipment improved steadily, making it easier for strike leaders to coordinate attacks and for pilots to report results back to their carriers. Perhaps most importantly, The mechanics and ground crews who maintained the aircraft became increasingly skilled at keeping them in top condition despite the harsh environment of carrier operations, where salt spray, humidity, and constant use created maintenance challenges that required dedication and expertise to overcome. The transformation of American dive bombers from ridiculed targets to precision weapons had strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of individual battles, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific and making an Allied victory not merely possible but increasingly inevitable. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway represented a loss of naval capability that Japan could not replace, given the time required to build new carriers and the even longer period needed to train the skilled aviators who would operate from them. American industrial capacity, by contrast, was producing new carriers, aircraft, and trained crews at an accelerating rate that would eventually give the United States an overwhelming advantage in every category of naval power. The dive bomber pilots who had achieved near-perfect accuracy at the crucial moment had bought time for this industrial advantage to manifest itself, preventing a Japanese victory that might have forced a negotiated peace and allowed Japan to consolidate its conquests. The psychological impact of Midway on both sides was equally important, with American forces gaining confidence from the victory, while Japanese commanders began to doubt their ability to defeat an enemy that had proven capable of learning from defeats and turning the tables so dramatically. The Battle of Midway shifted the strategic initiative from Japan to the United States, forcing the Japanese into a defensive posture from which they would never recover, and allowing American forces to choose where and when to attack rather than merely reacting to Japanese moves. The dive bomber squadrons that had made this victory possible continued to play crucial roles in subsequent campaigns, supporting the island-hopping strategy that gradually pushed Japanese forces back toward their home islands and destroyed their merchant fleet, cutting off the resources needed to sustain their war effort. Among the many dive bomber pilots who served with distinction during the Pacific War, certain individuals stood out for their skill, courage, and effectiveness in combat, becoming legends within their squadrons and earning recognition that has lasted long after the war ended. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow a Japanese destroyer led to the discovery of the enemy carriers at Midway, demonstrated the importance of intuitive judgment and aggressive leadership in combat, pressing on with his search when other commanders might have turned back, and then coordinating the attack that destroyed 2 of the 4 carriers sunk that day. His actions earned him the Navy Cross and established him as one of the heroes of the battle, though he always insisted that credit belonged equally to all the pilots who had flown that day, and especially to those who had not returned. Other pilots achieved remarkable individual records, sinking multiple enemy ships over the course of extended combat tour and surviving odds that should have killed them many times over. Some became aces not through shooting down enemy aircraft in fighter combat, but through the number of successful bombing attacks they completed, demonstrating that excellence in dive bombing required skills and courage every bit as demanding as those needed for aerial dogfighting. The radioman gunners who flew in the rear seats of dauntless bombers also earned recognition for their contributions, fighting off attacking enemy fighters, and sometimes taking over control of damaged aircraft when their pilots were wounded or killed. These partnerships between pilots and gunners exemplified the teamwork and mutual trust that characterized American naval aviation at its best, with both crew members depending on each other absolutely and sharing equally in both the dangers and the glories of combat. As the Pacific War drew toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, the dive bomber squadrons that had fought with such distinction throughout the conflict found their role changing and diminishing as new technologies and tactics reduced the need for the specialized skills they had developed. Fighter bombers carrying rockets and bombs could perform many of the same missions with less vulnerability to enemy defenses, while the declining strength of Japanese naval forces meant fewer opportunities for the kind of ship attacks that had been the dive bomber's specialty. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to a sudden end, sparing dive bomber crews from having to participate in the invasion of Japan that would almost certainly have resulted in heavy casualties despite American air superiority. The pilots and gunners who had survived the war returned home to a nation that celebrated them as heroes, but often struggled to understand what they had experienced and what the war had cost them personally. Many dive bomber veterans found it difficult to talk about their experiences, carrying memories of friends who had died and missions that had gone wrong, feeling that civilians could never truly understand what combat had been like. Some suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and anxiety that interfered with their ability to readjust to peacetime life. Others channeled their experiences into successful careers in aviation, business, or other fields, drawing on the leadership skills and confidence they had developed during the war. The aircraft they had flown, the beloved Dauntless that had carried so many of them through impossible dangers and brought them home safely, quickly disappeared from active service after the war ended, with most examples scrapped or sold for surplus as the military downsized and transitioned to jet-powered aircraft. Today, only a handful of surviving Dauntless bombers remain, preserved in museums where they serve as tangible reminders of the men who flew them and the crucial role they played in winning the Pacific War. The transformation of American dive bomber crews from objects of Japanese mockery to instruments of near-perfect accuracy offers profound lessons about the nature of military effectiveness, the importance of learning from defeat, and the danger of underestimating enemies based on early successes. The Japanese pilots who had laughed at the clumsy American bombers in early 1942 made the fatal mistake of assuming that their enemies would remain incompetent, failing to recognize that the Americans were learning from every battle and improving with every mission. This failure of imagination and analysis cost Japan dearly at Midway and contributed to the ultimate defeat of their entire war effort. The American aviators, for their part, demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination, refusing to be discouraged by early defeats, and instead analyzing what had gone wrong and developing solutions that transformed failure into triumph. The legacy of the dive bomber pilots extends beyond their immediate military achievements to encompass broader principles about excellence, teamwork, and the pursuit of perfection under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. These aviators prove that accuracy in combat is not a matter of luck, but rather the result of rigorous training, sound tactics, proper equipment, and the courage to execute under fire despite fear and overwhelming odds. Their example influenced subsequent generations of military aviators who studied the battles of the Pacific War and learned the importance of precision weapons delivery, coordination between different types of aircraft, and the need for constant training and improvement. Modern naval aviation, with its sophisticated guided weapons and advanced aircraft, owes a debt to the dive bomber pilots who proved that aircraft could sink ships and that air power could be decisive in naval warfare when employed with skill and determination. In the decades since World War II ended, the story of American dive bomber pilots and their transformation from underdogs to victors has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films that have introduced new generations to these remarkable aviators and their achievements. The Battle of Midway in particular has been the subject of extensive historical analysis and popular dramatization, with historians recognizing it as one of the most decisive battles not just of World War II, but of all modern military history. The pilots who flew at Midway and in other Pacific battles have been honored with medals, memorials, and recognition that acknowledges their crucial contribution to Allied victory. Annual reunions of dive bomber squadrons brought veterans together to share memories and maintain the bonds formed during the war. Though these gatherings have become smaller and less frequent, as the passage of time has taken its inevitable toll on the men who fought that conflict. The few surviving dauntless aircraft in museums have become pilgrimage sites for aviation enthusiasts and history buffs who want to see and touch these historic machines, and imagine what it must have been like to fly them in combat. Restoration projects have returned some of these aircraft to flying condition, allowing modern audiences to see them perform at air shows and appreciate the skill required to fly them properly. These preserved aircraft serve as tangible links to the past, physical reminders of a time when the fate of nations hung on the courage and skill of young men who climbed into open cockpits and dove toward heavily defended targets, trusting in their training and their aircraft to get them through alive. The story of these aviators and their aircraft remains relevant today not merely as history, but as inspiration, demonstrating that determination, skill, and courage can overcome even the most daunting challenges. The journey from contempt to respect, from failure to triumph, from ridicule to legend, represents one of the most remarkable transformations in military history, a story of human determination and skill development that changed the course of the Pacific War and demonstrated the power of precision weapons delivered by courageous and superbly trained aviators. The Japanese pilots who mocked American dive bombers in early 1942 had every reason to feel confident based on what they had observed, but they failed to recognize that they were witnessing not permanent incompetence, but rather the painful early stages of a learning process that would ultimately produce aviators capable of near-perfect accuracy when it mattered most. The American dive bomber crews who suffered through those early defeats refused to accept failure as permanent, instead analyzing what had gone wrong and developing the tactics, training, and techniques that would allow them to achieve devastating effectiveness at Midway and beyond. Their transformation from objects of mockery to instruments of precision destruction became possible through a combination of factors that included improved training, better tactics, technological refinements, and above all the courage and determination of individual pilots and gunners who refused to give up despite daunting odds. The legacy of these aviators extends far beyond their immediate military achievements to encompass broader lessons about excellence, perseverance, and the danger of underestimating opponents based on early encounters. The story of how American dive bombers evolved from easy targets to deadly weapons serves as a reminder that initial defeats do not determine final outcomes, that learning and adaptation can overcome even significant disadvantages, and that contempt for one's enemies is a luxury that no military force can afford. The pilots who flew the Dauntless into combat, who pushed their aircraft into near-vertical dives through walls of anti-aircraft fire, who released their bombs with accuracy that seemed almost miraculous, and who pulled out of those dives with scant feet to spare above the ocean surface, earned their place in history not through one dramatic moment, but through countless missions executed with professional excellence and extraordinary courage. Their transformation from ridiculed beginners to legendary warriors represents a triumph of human skill and determination that continues to inspire and educate more than 8 decades after the battles they fought, ensuring that their story and their achievements will never be forgotten as long as people remember and honor those who served with such distinction during humanity's darkest and most challenging hours.